Halloween, by the many accounts one reads and hears, is a controversial holiday in certain Christian circles. It seems some aren't quite sure what to do with it, and so either dismiss it completely, or it falls into the old vicious circle of we don't really understand it doesn't seem Christian, therefore it must be evil. If it's evil, it must be demonic and satanic, etc., etc. A few have ventured to ask essentially the same question. Why is it that some Christian denominations seem to have, for lack of a better way of putting it, a real fear of Halloween and of celebrating it? Let's examine this idea. We have to first start by exploring three common things people associate Halloween with. The old Celtic celebration of Samhain, asserting that most of Halloween's customs originate with ancient Samhain celebrations. Satanism, asserting that Halloween's origins are satanic, as evidenced by the many Satanists who use this day to promote their beliefs. And All Saints' Day, asserting that the early church established the holiday to Christianize Samhain. As historian Ronald Hutton notes, until the middle of the 20th century, anthropologists automatically assumed that any festival, however new it actually was, and no matter where it came from, had ancient pagan roots, even if the people celebrating it gave a different story. They were simply thought to be ignorant of its origins. There was a romanticization of rural cultures such that it was thought that the rural folk were holders of ancient wisdom, but simultaneously ignorant that they held such wisdom or that it was ancient. So they needed academics to explain it to them based on theories that have long been discredited. Halloween is no exception to the above process. It seems no matter where you look, from various educational websites to entries in dictionaries and encyclopedias, and even in some scholarly articles, Halloween is always connected to the ancient Gaelic celebration of Samhain. And of course that comes with the full gambit of all the myths, legends and lore that have surrounded the holiday for well over 1,000 years, including a lot of the religious, what I would say, sort of paranoia. I'm sure you've heard some of these before. Halloween is the worship of the devil. Halloween comes from heathen roots. Trick or treat comes from an ancient pagan custom. Satanic worshipping druids would go from house to house, seeking a virgin to sacrifice. If you complied, they left a jack-o'-lantern outside of your door with a candle inside, made from human fat. If you did not comply, a terrible trick would be played on you. The Catholic Church perpetuated the pagan legends with its Feast of All Saints. If you let your kids celebrate Halloween, you expose them to the possibility of demonic possession, etc., 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 ad nauseum. Well, don't these facts about Halloween's origins prove that it's an abomination? The question that arises is this connection between Halloween and Samhain legitimate, and are all these facts about it actually true? For a serious researcher, perhaps the most difficult aspect of researching these various origins, traditions, and assumed truths about Halloween is sifting through all the data and separating what is historical fact from the myth, legend, and, frankly, religious paranoia of what is historical fiction. It's not an easy task. Indeed, what makes this even more difficult is that so many of these quote-unquote facts, suppositions, and assumptions are so ill-researched and have been repeated for so long that they have essentially become accepted as truth. As I previously mentioned, one can find these asserted facts in everything ranging from various educational websites to entries in dictionaries and encyclopedias, and even in some scholarly articles. What we find after close examination and scrutiny, however, is that the accepted origin of most Halloween traditions' beliefs comes from the latter, historical fiction, rather than the former, historical fact. Completely contrary to what many would have one believe, Halloween is not a holiday that has close ties to the ancient past, nor does it have some pagan antecedent, nor is it a continuation of several ancient pre-Christian customs. The truth is, to say Halloween's connections to ancient Samhain, or anything ancient for that matter, are at best extremely tenuous, would be grossly overstating the facts. Halloween just does not have the pagan precedent so many people seem to desperately want it to. Even the concept of trick-or-treat is a relatively new phenomenon, originating from right here in the US from about the 1920s or so, and represents a mix of cultures, capitalism, especially capitalism, and accommodation. Even the custom of wearing costumes dates from about the same time. Costumes at Halloween do not tie back to the medieval guising or mumming or souling. To be completely fair, a few customs associated with Halloween do have a very old past, most notably the carving of root vegetables and the various apple traditions, for example, bobbing for apples. Without going into all the lengthy details, the carving of root vegetables dates to around the 1700s. It's just not historically attested any earlier than that. Bobbing for apples is a fall activity not specifically connected to Halloween and comes from a British woman's courting custom historically attested to about the 1300s. Neither custom is associated with, nor can they be historically attested back to, Samhain, or Pomona in the case of the apple customs. The simple truth is, what we definitively know about Samhain, facts that can be historically documented, would fill about a page and a half of paper. For those who are curious about these facts surrounding Samhain, in brief, most accounts we have come from early Christian Irish monks who, for obvious reasons, painted it in the worst light possible, embellishing their stories with superstitions that were current in their day. The reality is that they really knew nothing more of Samhain than we do today. The primary source of what is known comes from the books of the Ulster cycle. By most historical accounts, Samhain proper was preceded by 3 days, and followed by 3 nights, and followed by 3 days. It was preceded by 3 days and followed by 3 days. In some accounts, it's only a 3-day celebration, not a 7-day. Samhain seems to have been a time to prepare for the winter, cull the herds, and celebrate the final harvest of the year. One particular activity that Old Gaelic texts seem to suggest was very popular at Samhain was horse racing. That sounds a lot like many European holidays today from October to January. Ancient Gaelic texts also speak of it as a time to pay tithings, gather taxes, and the holding of a judicial assembly, very similar to the modern Manx Tynwald Day. Indeed, the word Samhain itself in Irish Gaelic, Savin in Scots Gaelic, and Samhain in Manx Gaelic simply means summer's end in these languages. It's also the name for the entire month of November. For example, in Scots Gaelic, Misatawin is the month of November, or the month of Samhain. Another possible etymology recently proposed is the Old Irish samana, meaning a gathering or an assembly, since on that day the people gathered together to celebrate the final harvest of the year and for all of the various assemblies. This latter etymology, it is argued, makes it cognate to the word for gathering in other older Indo-European languages. Indeed, the Gaelic word may in fact quite neatly incorporate both concepts into one, with the idea of a gathering at summer's end. As Hutton notes, there seems to be no doubt that the opening of November was the time of a major festival, which was celebrated at the very least in all those parts of the British Isles with a pastoral economy. At most, it may have been general among the Celtic peoples. The Gauls apparently celebrated it as well, based upon the appearance on the colony calendar. There is no evidence, however, that it was connected with the dead, and no proof that it opened the year. The 2nd century colony calendar, engraved on a bronze tablet found in Colony, France, suggests that the new year was celebrated on May 1st, with the holiday Beltane. Is it just me, or am I not seeing anything demonic in any of this? Nor am I seeing anything that smacks of modern Halloween. As B.A. Barr notes in a 2018 article, it is the medieval Christian festivals of All Saints and All Souls that provide our firmest foundation for Halloween. Further, as historian Nicholas Rogers, author of Halloween from Pagan Ritual to Party Night, Oxford University, 2002, states, if Samhain imparted to Halloween a supernatural charge and an intrinsic liminality, it did not offer much in the way of actual ritual practices, save in its fire rites. Most of these developed in conjunction with the medieval holy days of All Souls and All Saints' Day. Indeed, most of the traditions we associate with Halloween are medieval or early modern in their origin, not pagan. From this medieval perspective, Halloween is a celebration of Christian triumph over paganism, rather than a pagan holiday masquerading as Christian. I was hesitant to include this, but since it does play a part in the subject of this discussion, let's take a closer look at it. The assertion that Christian All Saints and All Souls Day replaced Gaelic Samhain. To state it briefly, the date of 1st November for All Saints' Day was practiced in continental Europe long before the date was formally fixed by the Church to November 1st, and long before said change got to what is now the UK and Ireland, which was centuries after the time of the Druids and Samhain proper. In addition, most people are not aware that Samhain itself is a movable feast day. The exact date varies from year to year depending on when the autumnal equinox and winter solstice fall. In 2020, for example, Samhain proper fell on the 6th and 7th of November. Samhain seems to have been associated with the Seven Sisters, the Pleiades. It is said to have occurred at the culmination of the Pleiades, when they reached their highest point in the sky at midnight. To assert that the establishment of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day on November 2nd was the early church's attempt to Christianize Samhain just does not stand to reason. Think about this logically for a moment. Why would the church change a major feast day affecting all of Western Christendom just to accommodate a small group of Christians who lived on what would be considered at that time some remote group of islands in the middle of nowhere, that centuries after Samhain and the Druids? One scholar has even suggested that November 1st may have been chosen simply so that the many pilgrims who traveled to Rome to commemorate the saints could be fed more easily after the harvest than in the spring when it was originally celebrated. That certainly does not seem out of the realm of possibility. Though this may not have been the predominant reason, I'd be willing to bet that it may have been taken into consideration when the date was changed. Our ultimate conclusion, then, is simply this. Contrary to what many believe or were taught, all three holidays, Halloween, All Saints' Day, and Samhain, developed completely independent of each other. They do, however, all share a common date and perhaps a feeling, but that's really about it. Indeed, so much of Halloween feels pagan that attempts to connect those things to ancient Samhain simply feels right. Now, what about all those Satanists out there? After all, as some people will be quick to remind, the author of the Satanic Bible himself even said, "I am glad that Christian parents let their children worship the devil at least one night out of the year." Hard to argue with that. Halloween's association with satanic worship and practices, though real, is a very modern phenomenon, about the 1960s to present, and, of course, has zero connection to the pre-Christian Celtic holiday Samhain. Most people do not realize that the connection here is no more than 50 or 60 years old. For those who observe Samhain, Satanists are regarded with just as much disgust and disdain, indeed if not more so, than Christians regard them. Satanists are responsible for appropriating this day to not only promulgate their beliefs, but to completely twist the day into something it never was. Not to defend them in any way, but again, to be completely fair, it should be noted that most supposed practices of these groups are, again, based on complete misinformation and supposition, not actual fact. Many of their assumed and supposed practices stem from the so-called Satanic panic, a conspiracy theory that swept across America in the 1980s and early 90s. It seems, however, that some Christian denominations are doing their darndest to bring it back and repackage it for a new generation. Interviews and testimonies from Satanic panic holdovers, as well as relative newcomers such as John Ramirez, and so-called self-styled ex-wishes, ex-Satanists, etc., are just a few of the many examples. Others, such as the late Anton LaVey, completely capitalized to the extreme on people's fear and assumptions about Satanism. LaVey's brand of Satanism actually had nothing to do with Satan at all. LaVey was an atheist. His brand of Satanism is an atheistic philosophy and is not at all theological. His famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, quote, which I gave above, if he actually even ever said it, it's essentially an urban legend that seems to have originated with certain Christian groups. He was probably being sarcastic. He took full advantage of an opportunity to capitalize on some people's fear and assumptions about Halloween and, more to the point, Satanism. Not to defend him in any way, but it should be further noted that LaVey explicitly condemned, amongst other things, the harming of children and animal sacrifice. Again, that's just documented fact. But we've kind of completely digressed, so where does this alleged fear about Halloween that makes it so controversial in certain Christian denominations come from? Well, a few historians have taken a stab at an answer. As one internet commenter opined, Halloween represents a blurring of boundaries. It's a day where things that are supposed to be scary come to the normal world, and we, normal people, meet them halfway. It's a day when people pretend to be what they are not, at least on the outside. Certain Christian groups can't abide this boundary blurring. They cannot abide people entertaining the idea of bending boundaries. Studies on conformity are quite clear. Any dissert opens the door to more dissent, and certain Christian groups can't allow any of it. And as commentator D. Lichty noted, the evangelical anxiety about Halloween is a direct reflection of a more general anxiety about hell, Satan, anything deemed demonic, and death. On a more historical and cultural level, this fear or anxiety may be more deeply rooted. To paraphrase from an article written in 2018 by B.A. Barr on why evangelical Christians seem to fear Halloween, she notes that in the aftermath of the Reformation, some fervent Protestant groups, like the Puritans for example, regarded holy days with strong Catholic roots, such as All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, with a great deal of suspicion and condemned them as popish inventions. A holy day like Halloween, All Hallows' Eve, which had no direct association with the life of Jesus, didn't have a chance with radical reformers. It was just too Catholic. This is precisely what historian Ronald Hutton argues when he wrote, "To describe Halloween as fundamentally unchristian is therefore either ill-informed or disingenuous. Such an attitude could be most sympathetically portrayed as a logical development of radical Protestant hostility to to the holy days of All Souls and All Saints. Ironically, Hutton continues, it is because of the agenda of evangelical Protestants to eradicate papal traditions that holidays like Halloween now appear divorced from Christianity. Hutton goes on to say that by eliminating the doctrine of purgatory and the cult of the saints, the Protestants left nothing but a vague sense of Halloween as a time with creepy associations. In other words, it was Protestant fear of Catholicism that made Halloween appear less Christian and, in their eyes, more evil. Do the roots of evangelical Protestant hostility to Halloween have less to do with Celtic paganism and more to do with anti-Catholicism? Hutton concludes, I don't think this is the whole story, but evidence suggests that buried deep in Protestant anti-Halloween rhetoric, a lingering fear of Catholicism endures. Moving on, many will be quick to argue that Halloween is a day which glorifies evil or does not glorify God. When one participates in Halloween, one is not participating in evil or death per se. Rather, one of the main points of the modern holiday is to mock these things. I think that's a major point that many people seem to completely miss or not quite understand. On another philosophical or psychological level, it allows people to explore their darker side, psyche, if you will, a time to explore a side of themselves they would not normally expose or perhaps even consider. It's a part of being human. I somehow don't think God would object to humans being human. It's a time to play on a few of the basic core fears of man, fear of what lurks in the dark and fear of death. The aspects of these fears that people just don't like to think about are now exposed for all to see and experience. A sort of annual self-check to make sure that that part of our humanity is still there, so to speak. In the end, most people realize it for what it is. As one commenter puts it from an Orthodox Christian view, this smear campaign against Halloween, in which it has been scapegoated among Christians as the ultimate manifestation of secularism and Satanism in contemporary culture, only goes back to fairly recent modern times, when certain Christian groups resorted to any fanciful tale to counter the emerging counterculture of the 1960s and 70s that they perceived as corrupting youth. Christian leaders since then have clutched us in a guilt trip ever since about a holiday which, prior to this extreme reaction, was indeed harmless for the most part, like any other holiday, and had no connection with satanic rituals. It was a cultural festival which, though mischievous at times, really posed no threat to society until we were forced to believe that it did. And finally, as Orthodox priest Father M. Setsema quipped in a 2010 article about Halloween, and let's be honest, modern Halloween, for you and me, and even the Wiccans down the street, has nothing to do with virgin sacrifice or black magic. It's about having fun in a costume and eating things your dentist wouldn't approve of. No one was ever possessed by the devil because he or she dressed up for Halloween, or passed out licorice, or read a Harry Potter book. Our modern lives have way too many other avenues for temptation to enter, and these things are the real cause of our spiritual problems. In the end, we are forced to conclude that, like it or not, Halloween is only evil for those who choose to make it so.